Welcome to You Brew Kombucha. Today, I'm going to share some tips on using herbs, spices, and flowers to flavor your homemade kombucha. So kombucha is fantastic because it is infinitely flavorable. You can really use whatever flavor profiles and ingredients that you like to flavor your home brew. And I get a lot of questions about using herbs and spices and flowers to add some of those flavors to homemade kombucha. So I figured I would just share some of my tips. A lot of these flavorings, really all of these flavorings, I recommend only using it during the second fermentation phase once you're already flavoring your finished kombucha and are undergoing kind of a flavoring phase, either just to infuse it with flavorings or to produce carbonation. So if you're not familiar with the difference between first fermentation and second fermentation, I'll go ahead and link my videos on those processes down in the description box below. But my general guidance for all flavorings is to make sure that you're only doing it during the second fermentation phase of kombucha brewing. That'll just ensure that your SCOBY, or the symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that you're using to produce new batches of kombucha, are not affected in any way by these flavorings that you're adding to it. And I will say that a lot of this is so dependent on the type of herb that you're using, whether you're using fresh, whether you're using dried, how potent the herb is, how potent you like it to taste. And so I don't really have any set guidelines for specific measurements because a lot of the home brewing process really is just tasting as you go and really adjusting the flavoring depending on what flavor profile you're looking to achieve with your home brew. You're not going to find any specific measurements here, but I will give you some general guidelines that you can use as a jumping off point with these different ingredients. And then you can just adjust as you see fit. So if you have a batch where you find that, oh, I actually want a little bit more flavoring to come through, then you know that next time around you can just increase the amount of whatever ingredient it is that you're using. So I guess we can go ahead and just get started with a few different categories of herbs and spices. So I love using fresh herbs to flavor my kombucha. So here I've got some rosemary, I've got some Thai basil, I've got some mint, and one of these is actually one that I don't enjoy brewing kombucha with because for whatever reason, and I've tried this many times, fresh mint in my kombucha ferments, at the end of the second fermentation phase, it produces a very kind of skunky, musty quality in the kombucha that just doesn't remind me of the crisp, bright mintiness that fresh mint provides. And so I actually don't use mint in flavoring kombucha. And I've found this to be true for both dried and fresh mint, but I've just put it here as an example of what you can use. So if you find that you like the mint ferments in kombucha, then by all means go ahead and use it. For fresh herbs, I like to just go ahead and pluck a couple of leaves, bruise them around a little bit, and drop them into the bottle right before capping it off. And herbs are fantastic with so many different fruit flavors. I love mixing basil or Thai basil with berries. I also love mixing it with citrus or pineapple. Rosemary is probably my favorite herb to use in kombucha brewing. I go ahead and just use a whole entire sprig of rosemary, bruise it around, stick it in the bottle, seal it up, and let that ferment at room temperature for a few days. So that really gives the rosemary or whatever herb you're using a good amount of time to infuse into the liquid. And it makes for such a beautiful aromatic brew. So I love using rosemary, basil. Thyme is another herb that's really fantastic for kombucha brewing. I love just adding maybe 1 or 2 sprigs of thyme, doing the same thing, just bruising it around in your hand, sticking it in the bottle and letting that ferment. So fresh herbs, definitely fantastic for kombucha. I get a lot of people asking if dried herbs are appropriate for using in kombucha. I've tried it. Generally, in both cooking and in kombucha brewing, I generally try to stay away from using dried herbs because I find that it just doesn't provide that same level of potency and freshness that you get from the fresh herb. There are a couple of exceptions to that, of course. I do enjoy using dried bay leaf and dried oregano in cooking applications. I actually haven't tried those 2 herbs in kombucha brewing, but if you like those flavors, they tend to lean on the more savory side. So if you like a more savory tasting kombucha brew, then definitely give it a try. Let me know how it goes in the comments below if you do give it a shot. But generally, I don't enjoy using dried herbs for kombucha brewing because in the tests that I've run with them, I find that they do tend to produce musty, sort of dusty, funky flavors and aromas. And so I generally stay away from dried herbs. The exception to that would be for things like flowers. So flowers have slightly, even though flowers would technically fall under the category of an herb if you're using it in some sort of flavoring application, but flowers are a different story. So here I have some dried lavender, and I also have some dried saffron. So these are technically spices, but because they aren't leaves and because their flavor profiles are very floral, they don't produce that same musty, kind of funky aroma and aftertaste that dried leaves produce. So I do enjoy flavoring with dried flowers. You could technically just take the dried flower and put it into your bottle and let that infuse during the second fermentation phase. But I find that doesn't really produce a super robust flavor in the brew. So my preferred way of using flowers and floral flavors in kombucha is by making a syrup with it. I'm actually gonna go ahead and just make a syrup for you today. So we'll take about a tablespoon or two. Again, it's all very subjective to your taste preferences. And it's also dependent on how fresh and potent the herbs you're using are. But this lavender is really fragrant. It's very, very aromatic. So I'm just gonna go ahead and use a couple tablespoons or so of this dried lavender. And always make sure that you're using food grade ingredients. Now, when you're using herbs like lavender or rose hips, rose petals, any of those types of floral ingredients, make sure that you're always buying food grade, food safe ingredients, because there is a lot of overlap with the cosmetics industry. There are a lot of lavender scented and rose scented bath and beauty products. So just make sure that when you're buying these ingredients that it's intended for food purposes, eating purposes. So again, 2 tablespoons-ish of lavender. I'm going to add a bit of water, we'll say about a cup's worth of water. It's about a cup of water, 2 tablespoons of lavender. And this is gonna make for a pretty concentrated syrup. And I'm going to add about a cup of sugar as well. And I'm just gonna let that simmer until the lavender is fully infused into our simple syrup. And this is really my favorite way to flavor with dried flower. And these types of syrups are fantastic too, not only for flavoring kombucha, but also for flavoring cocktails or mocktails, just by making these simple syrups. And simple syrup is just another term for sugar water. In cocktail making, the most common ratio is equal parts sugar to water, but there are some cocktail recipes that call for 2 parts sugar, 1 part water. I generally like to just use equal parts of sugar and water, but we're just gonna keep stirring this around and letting that lavender fully infuse into this mix. And so I'm actually gonna go ahead and just put a lid on it so that it can come up to temperature a bit quicker. So while that is coming up to temperature, we can talk about another way that you can use flowers to infuse those floral flavors into your kombucha. So this is a pretty common ingredient in a lot of Middle Eastern cooking. So this is orange blossom water. I love using orange blossom water in kombucha because it just adds this very sweet, mild, slightly citrusy, but mostly kind of gardenia-like floral aroma to the kombucha. A little bit of this goes a long way. I would dose it out to maybe a ½ teaspoon per 16-ounce bottle and use that as a starting point. So that is simmering. And I'm just gonna let that simmer for a while, just to let that lavender fully infuse and really steep. And the water is turning a lovely shade of blue, actually, and when I decant this into the bottle, you'll be able to see it. What I like to do whenever I'm flavoring, whether it's with herbal infused simple syrups or even just fruit juices or fruit purees, is I always just go off of taste. So when I have my finished unflavored kombucha, I'll add my ingredients in small doses and taste as I go. And that's really how I determine how much of any ingredient I add to it, more so than any specific measurement. And what you want to shoot for generally when you're flavoring during second fermentation is you want the flavored kombucha to be just a tad too sweet for your taste preferences. And the reason for that is because as it undergoes secondary fermentation, so as it sits at room temperature to build up that carbonation, some of that sweetness is going to go away. It is going to get a little bit more acidic over the course of those however many days that you're undergoing second fermentation. And so by overshooting the sweetness a little bit during that flavoring stage, that allows the sweetness level to come down a little bit to a more palatable level once it's finished going through that second fermentation phase. So that's why whenever I'm tasting flavored kombucha before second fermentation, I always try to make sure that it is just a bit too sweet for my liking, so that once it's done second fermenting, it's right about at the perfect level of sweetness for me. So I'm just gonna give this a quick taste. That's wonderful. So it's got a very mild lavender flavor to it right now. If you want it to be more pronounced lavender, you can definitely add more lavender. I like where this is at right now. I think that'll mix in with kombucha really beautifully. So I'm just gonna go ahead and decant this into this bottle of mine. Look at that wonderful color. And I like leaving the lavender in the simple syrup, but if you want to strain it out, if you don't want to have those lavender flowers floating around in your kombucha, you can absolutely just strain it out. But I really like having lavender pieces float around in my kombucha, and I also just to keep it in the simple syrup so that it can continue to infuse over the next however many days that I'm keeping it in that bottle. A second way that you can make a simple syrup for kombucha brewing is using spices. So spices are fantastic. I always like to use whole spices. So here I've got a few different kinds. So here I've got some whole spices. I've got some cinnamon, I've got some star anise, and I have some cardamom. And I find that these are really fantastic for flavoring with kombucha. I'm gonna go ahead and make a syrup out of this as well. Just about another cup or so of water, another cup of sugar, and I'm just gonna go ahead and actually use all three of these spices to infuse this simple syrup with. So I'm just stirring that sugar, increase my heat a bit. And for these whole spices, you could absolutely use pre-ground spices, but I always like to have fresh spices on hand just because they retain the flavor and the aroma and the volatile essential oils in the spices a lot better when they are kept whole. If you have pre-ground spices, just make sure that you give them a smell. If it doesn't smell like anything when it's coming out of the tin or the bag that you use to keep it in, then it's not really gonna add a lot of flavor to whatever you add it into. You really wanna make sure that whatever spices you're using have really potent, fresh aroma to it. You could absolutely just go ahead and throw these spices directly into the simple syrup and let that simmer. But what I'm gonna do to try to extract a little bit more flavor out of them is just use my mortar and pestle to crush them around a little bit. So I am going to just add, we'll say about 5 star anise pieces. This looks like about a tablespoon, maybe 2 tablespoons worth of cardamom, and just a cinnamon stick. I'm breaking. And I'm just gonna go ahead and use my mortar and pestle to crush these up a little bit. And this is a totally optional step, but I find that the more you can crush the spices up a little bit before adding it to the liquid, the more they can release those flavors and essential oils to really perfume that simple syrup. So I'm just gonna add all of these spices. Again, we've got cinnamon, star anise, and cardamom into our simple syrup. Oh, and it already smells so good. Just give that a stir. So this is probably gonna take a little bit longer to infuse because spices are pretty woody a lot more woody and less delicate than the lavender or like flowers that we use to flavor. So I'm really gonna let this simmer for a good long while. I'm just gonna turn the heat a bit. And while those are infusing, we can also talk about cayenne pepper, which is another really great spice to use when flavoring kombucha. This, I don't make a syrup with it because it's already in powdered form. It's one of those things where it doesn't really have a ton of flavor, but it adds a nice warming heat to the kombucha. So this, totally fine to use pre-ground. You don't need to like buy a dried chili pepper and grind it into cayenne pepper yourself. It really depends on what flavor combination I'm making, and that really determines the amount of cayenne pepper that I like to add. But generally, I like to add about a pinch per bottle. 16-ounce bottle, 8-ounce bottle, just like a smidgen of a pinch. These are not very specific measurements. But again, because the cayenne pepper, it, depending on what brand you buy, it can really vary in terms of heat level, and everybody's palate is different. So again, my recommendation is to just start with a pinch, to use that as a starting point. And if you taste it and you find that it's too spicy or not spicy enough, you can always adjust from there. But I love using cayenne pepper for flavors like pineapple cayenne kombucha. You can make a spicy margarita type of flavor by mixing cayenne pepper with some lime and some orange juice in your kombucha, and it makes for a fantastic flavor. So I'm a really big fan of adding a little bit of heat to your kombucha with just a little bit of cayenne pepper. And I don't find the need to turn this into a syrup. I just go ahead and add it straight into the kombucha brew and let that second ferment at room temp. But that is another way that you can use spices to flavor your kombucha. Let that simmer on the stove for maybe 10-15 minutes or so. Spices are really woody and they're really hearty, so it's not going to get too bitter if you overboil it. Just make sure that the liquid doesn't evaporate out of the pot. As long as there's enough liquid to keep it at a simmer, that's fantastic. I love using this for kind of more fall-like, winter-like flavors. So this spiced syrup is fantastic for mixing with apple juice in kombucha. It's also fantastic for mixing with orange juice and flavoring kombucha. If you have some cloves, I love making a clove syrup and making an orange clove flavored kombucha right around the holidays. It's fantastic. You can also spike it with some whiskey and make it a little bit of a holiday cocktail. But this is now at a very active rolling boil. So we're really extracting a lot of flavor from these crushed up spices. It smells fantastic. You get a lot of the licoricey aroma from the star anise and the warming cinnamon spice and kind of a floral, kind of greener spice from the cardamom, but still warming. I love the way these flavors work together. Really delicious. Just gonna give it a quick taste. It tastes like the holidays, but yeah, I would just say let that continue to simmer for as long as you have patience for. If I had a ton of time, I would just let this keep simmering, but in the interest of kind of this demo, I'll go ahead and strain it out. It is pretty potent already, but again, just go ahead and adjust that timing based on how concentrated you want this to be and how much time you have. So I'm gonna go ahead and strain this. And for this, I am gonna use a strainer just to catch all of the little bits that I crushed up in the mortar and pestle. So now we've got our lavender simple syrup, we've got our warming spiced simple syrup. I like to use about a teaspoon or two per 16-ounce kombucha bottle to flavor it. Again, my recommendation is always just to add a little bit to start and then add more if you feel like you want the flavor to be more pronounced. If you're concerned about the sugar, what I will also say is that you don't need to add this much sugar, but as I've mentioned in other videos about kombucha, adding a little bit of sugar during the second fermentation phase is actually a good thing. It gives the yeast some fresh nutrients to feed on to basically create carbon dioxide. That fermentation will continue during the second fermentation phase, so some of that sweetness will taper off and it will get more acidic as that fermentation happens. happens. Especially if you're only flavoring with herbs and not any fruits, that sugar is actually going to be key. If you don't add enough sugar to the brew, then the yeast won't have enough nutrient to feed on to create carbon dioxide. So that's another question that I get all the time from people who would like to flavor with herbs or spices and no fruit. They generally find that their brews don't carbonate quite as well. So even if the herbal flavor, the floral flavor is delicious, they ferment at room temperature for a set number of days, but they're finding that they're not getting the carbonation that they like. So that's where the sugar in these simple syrups is really gonna come in handy to basically give the yeast more nutrients to feed on to create that carbon dioxide during that second fermentation phase. So I hope this was helpful. Again, there are so many different ways that you can flavor kombucha, and I hope this was inspiring. You can really mix and match. I actually love mixing herbs and spices together. Saffron works fantastically with cinnamon because saffron gives a warming floral quality while the cinnamon gives it a little bit more heat and spice. You can really mix and match however you see fit. And if you want more recommendations for different spices and flowers and herbal flavor combinations, definitely check out my book, The Kombucha Crafter's Logbook, which is available for sale on Amazon. I'll go ahead and put a link to that book down in the description box below. But I have a whole flavoring section in the book that outlines different flavor profiles for fruits and for herbs and spices and flowers. And I always find myself going back to that as a little bit of an index to help me decide what flavors I want to mix and match. So if you're looking to be inspired with new flavor combinations, definitely check out my book, The Kombucha Crafter's Logbook. But I hope this was helpful. If you have more questions about the kombucha brewing process or just want to watch more videos and get inspired to make new flavor combinations, definitely check out the other videos on my channel. And as always, you can find more information at youbrewkombucha.com. Happy brewing!